CTR 2021 Qualitative Seminar Series. I'm Rochelle Rosen. I'm one of the faculty in the Advance-CTR's Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design Core. Today we'll hear from Dr. Akilah Dulin about concept mapping. I'm going to turn this over to her in a moment, but first, as in the other two webinars, I want to let our attendees know that in this webinar we cannot see or hear you at this point. Dr. Dulin is going to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have some opportunity to answer your questions. You can ask questions or make comments through the chat, and I'm going to get them to her after her talk. Then at about 12 noon, we're going to be able to link those who choose to stay with us until 12:30 for a face-to-face discussion about concept mapping and qualitative methods. I'll let you know when we make that change, so those who want to stay with us will be able to stay on and actually chat with us. For now, I want to introduce Dr. Akilah Dulin. Dr. Dulin is an associate professor of behavioral and social sciences in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences in the Brown University School of Public Health. She's affiliated with the Center for Health Promotion and Health Equity. Dr. Dulin has two primary research foci. They include examining risk factors and resilience resources related to cardiovascular disease risk, like diet, physical activity, obesity. The other is HIV outcomes among racial and ethnic minorities and across the lifespan. She uses a variety of research approaches to examine these research areas, including community engaged research, mixed methods, quantitative methods, and secondary data analysis. Today, I'm incredibly excited that she's going to give us an overview and understanding of concept mapping methodology. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome.
Thank you, Rochelle, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to the Advance-CTR for the invitation, as well as I'd like to thank the Advance-CTR team for managing all the logistics to make this series happen, and my invitation happen as well. So I have to say, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being at this talk. As Rochelle mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about concept mapping methodology, and specifically, I'm going to explain how we applied it to our project to understand resilience resources among African Americans living with HIV in the Southern United States. So first, I should tell you a little bit about what concept mapping entails. And it is a fabulous structured methodology that entails a lot of strengths. And so, I mean, you can tell I'm a little biased about this method. It incorporates both qualitative and quantitative methods to take participant-generated ideas and concepts and represents them visually via these two-dimensional maps. And there are, other analysis components to concept mapping as well. And it involves up to 6 steps. And I say up to 6 steps because you don't have to follow all of them. There is some flexibility built in. So why did we even think about using concept mapping? Well, our goal was we had 3 sequential steps of an R01 grant, and our primary goal was first to develop a reliable and valid measure, but we had to take a step back, and before we could even develop a reliable and valid measure and examine how resilience is associated with HIV over time, we realized that we actually needed to develop the measure first. And we thought about the different strengths and weaknesses of both qualitative and quantitative methods when it comes to measure development. And we landed on using the advanced concept mapping methodology to generate items that capture all components of resilience. And so when we're talking about resilience, we're really focusing on this idea that there's psychological, behavioral, and social adaptation in the face of adversity, where an individual draws upon their families and their community's resources to overcome these adversities or threats to health. So you probably heard terms such as flourishing, grit, self-determination, self-efficacy, where we're talking about, or optimism. Those are some examples of individual level resilience resources. And so we took this advanced concept mapping approach to make sure we capture all components of resilience, because when we looked at the literature in the context of HIV, specifically for people living with HIV, we found that there were a number of limitations in resilience measurements. One of the first being is that they were missing a socio-ecological contextual approach. Often and historically in the literature, resilience had been identified as an individual level trait or state. And so most of the measures like the Connor-David Resilience Scale or the Brief Resilient Coping Scale focus mostly on these individual level factors. However, recent research advocates for a more of a socio-ecological approach. So thinking about resilience resources that an individual possesses within themselves, but also what resources exist outside the context of said individual so that they're able to overcome these adversities to health. And when we also did a deep dive in the literature for people living with HIV, what we found is that most resilience measures were not specific to them in the quantitative literature. And this actually was in contrast to a rich body of qualitative literature that people living with HIV expressed that there were resilience resources that they drew upon specific to the context of living with HIV. And so using these generic measures of resilience that don't include HIV may overlook some of the resources that people may draw on. And additionally, what we found in our review of the literature is that most of the quantitative measures, if not, well, most of them were developed without the input of the people who have these lived experiences. And so we thought that representing and including the voices of people and finding out how they perceive resilience resources would be important to inform understanding of this what we think, very important area of research. And so using this process of concept mapping really allowed us to then use this mixed methods approach to identify multi-level resilience resources among African Americans living with HIV who demonstrated progression through the stages of the HIV care continuum. And let me just qualify this as that these are adults. And when we refer to multi-level, well, when I refer to multi-level resilience resources, I'm really talking about those resources at different levels of a socio-ecological model. Second, using concept mapping allowed us to examine whether the importance of resilience resources differed by important demographic and neighborhood risk environment factors. So using this concept mapping approach really allowed us to do several things, and these are many advantages that I think of related to concept mapping. One is that it allowed us to balance the power dynamic. And so participants' voices were well represented in the generation of the resilience resource items that are included in our future measure. It also integrates both qualitative and quantitative methods in unique and innovative ways, drawing on the strengths of some of the strengths of each. It also allowed us to represent the participant generated data as maps and pictures, which is really important because it gave us a precursor or an idea of the different domains we could expect for how resilience resources were conceptualized by participants. Fourth, it also increases ecological validity because it's representing participants' lived experiences, which may make it more generalizable to the population of interest. And last, it informs future research. So we use it to inform a measure, and we'll be using it to inform potential interventions as well. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 6 steps of concept mapping. The first step is preparing. The second step is generating ideas. Step 3 involves structuring. Steps 4 and 5 are analyzing, interpreting the data. And step 6 refers to utilization. So in step 1, we developed the focus prompt to guide step 2, generating ideas with participants. And in step 2, this is again just the summary of the methodology that we use to understand the resilience resources among the population of interest. For step 2, we conducted modified nominal group technique with 27 African American adults. And we took the number of statements that they generated and were able to whittle it down to 95 in our statement review process. In step 3, we took all the statements generated from step 2 and conducted sorting and rating with 42 African American adults. They sorted the statements basically into conceptually similar groups, rated the statements on relative importance and ease of intervention. And so the results I'm going to show you today only focus on relative importance and do not include the ease of intervention output. In steps 4 and 5, analyzing and interpreting, we generated the concept maps, and those concept maps represent participant sorting data. And then we took their rating scores to create ladder graphs and also determine the relative importance of each of the concepts represented in the concept maps. And lastly, for utilization, I'll talk a little bit about measure development and our dissemination strategies. So to do a deep dive into each of these steps, I thought we could focus on each one in a little bit more detail. And so the first one that I actually want to talk to you all about is step one, which is preparing for the project. And in this step is when you work with your team or others of interest to develop the focus prompt that guides your research overall. And this focus prompt is really the question that you'll use with step two sessions with participants so that they can generate ideas. And so developing the focus prompt is where you want to make sure that you have it right and take your time. And so it's a very iterative process, and your focus prompt should be guided by your research question, what are the gaps in the literature, what is there about, theory, for example, and you should also make sure that you try to word it at an appropriate level. So for our project, we developed 3 sub-questions, which we then combined to create one overarching question for analyses. And then we looked at the Microsoft Word, Flesch Kincaid, to make sure that the questions were written at 7.2 or lower grade level. So as I mentioned before, we were very interested in this multi-level concept of resilience. And so we developed the sub-questions to focus on the different levels of resilience, of the socio-ecological model. And so for sub-question 1, our focus prompt was, we know that there are ongoing challenges in all people's lives. What is it about you that helps you adapt to these challenges so that you're able to stick with your HIV care? This means things like going to your scheduled HIV clinic appointments and taking HIV medications as prescribed. And so when we developed our questions, we were really interested in focusing on challenges or adversities that people face in general, and not just those specific to HIV, because those aren't the only specific adversities that anyone faces. So we wanted to make sure that they were generally speaking, and we also wanted to point out the chronicity of adversities that people experience. And we also wanted to make sure that we created an understandable way to tap into the concept of resilience without including the word resilience in the focus prompt questions. And you'll note that our outcome is HIV care. And here we provided a definition so that everyone had a standardized way of thinking when we said what HIV care means. So again, schedule HIV clinic appointments and medication adherence. The second question that we developed focused on interpersonal level. So again, we started out with this, we know that there are ongoing challenges in all people's lives, but what you'll see is that we ask about people in general. So thinking about their family and friends and anyone else, like their HIV care providers and any other people in their lives. So again, this sub-question focused on interpersonal level resilience resources. And our last question focused on neighborhood resources. And so you'll see that in the second part of this question is, what is it about your neighborhood that helps you adapt to these challenges so that you're able to stick with your HIV care? And we discussed quite a bit about how to define neighborhood and took into account that people may be unstably housed. And so we added a qualifier. And so the last part of the question is, please define neighborhood based on the area around where you live most of the time. Please think about the people, places, and other things in your neighborhood. And you'll see we use the caveat qualifier of live most of the time, because people are transitory in nature. And as our members of our research team, especially those in the clinic staff, indicated that people with who are able to be have favorable HIV outcomes can sometimes be unstably housed. And so we needed to make sure that the definition of neighborhood was inclusive to those participants as well. So we took those 3 questions that we generated and we used them to facilitate modified nominal group techniques. And so basically the nominal group technique, we asked participants to engage in 5-minute silent generation of ideas in response to focus prompt sub-question 1. And after those 5 minutes of idea generation were concluded, then we used a round robin format where participants provided each participant provided one statement from their paper, and we went around the room until all ideas were exhausted. And using this approach, participants could pass if they didn't have any other ideas. And of course, they could, when their turn came back around, they could always add something later. And so the reason why we call the modified nominal group technique is because participants did not engage in deletion or editing or of the statement set, and they also didn't engage in any prioritizing or ranking, because that actually occurs in step 3 of concept mapping. So we just used this very structured nominal group technique approach to generate very focused short statements in response to the focus prompt. And so we followed that process for each of the sub questions. And so sub question 1, we did the modified nominal group technique. Then sub question 2, same process, followed by the third sub question, and again, follow the same process. And so at these sessions, there were 2 co-facilitators. One facilitator used a structured nominal group technique script, and the other co-facilitator wrote each participant's statement in full view of all participants on sticky paper. So at the end of step 2, we completed 5 nominal group technique groups. And then we also conducted 11 one-on-one interviews. Not interviews, we actually used the same modified nominal group technique even in the one-on-one sessions, but we wanted to make sure that participants who did not feel comfortable attending in a group could meet with us one-on-one to protect their confidentiality. And we, the goal of these is to reach content saturation. So what is content saturation? It's basically when there are very few new ideas generated by participants in response to the focus prompts. And we definitely reach content saturation even with a sample size of 27. Participants also completed some brief demographic information at step 2. So across all 27 participants, they generated 365 statements in response to the 3 focus prompts that they were presented. And so we engaged in a statement refining and cleaning process to whittle the statement set down to a more manageable statement set. Group concept mapping recommends that you have the software, the company actually recommends no more than 100 statements are provided in subsequent steps as a way to minimize participant burden. And so what we did is we took these 365 statements and we entered them into each statement into one Excel worksheet tab. And figure 4 provides an example of the sample coding, keywording, and statement process, but it's for illustrative purposes. This is not for the current project, but this is just an example that I wanted to show you. And so we did this, so we ended up with 365 rows, and each statement was read, a keyword and a code was assigned to each one. And then we engaged in a sorting process to try to group them together. And then we engaged in editing. So we were able to see, using this coding and keywording, the statements that were redundant. And there were about 95 statements that, said something of a version or another of the same thing. So those could be deleted immediately. But we also logged what we did. And actually, let me step back a little bit, because the first worksheet tab, we just assigned the codes and the keywords. And this represented the total 365 statements that were unmodified. We copied and pasted the 365 statements into a second worksheet tab, and that's where the editing and cleaning began. And so we did this over the process of about 6 different worksheet tabs to refine and reduce the number of statements. We cleaned them, we separated out compound ideas, we deleted statements that were, again, redundant or unrelated to the focus prompts. And so at the end of the cleaning of the participant generated statements, we ended up with 106 participant statements that we retained. In addition, we reviewed the literature for publicly available resilience measures and identified where there were gaps in themes or ideas that our participants didn't generate. And so at the end, we added 10 additional statements based on the quantitative literature. So we ended up with 116 statements. And then again, because our goal was to develop a measure, we actually completed what's called the Content Validity Index. And that calls for, for our project, that meant that 3 resilience experts plus 1 expert in psychometrics reviewed all of the 116 statements and used this structured systematic way, again, this content validity index analysis, to determine if if each statement reflected the construct of resilience. Each person individually rated the statements, and then we met as a group and reviewed all of our results. If there was disagreement in whether even just one of the reviewers felt that it didn't reflect the concept of resilience, it was resolved by agreement to either omit the statement or retain it. And so after participant generating ideas, all their ideas were cleaned, the 10 additional statements were added, and at the end of the content validity index, we ended up retaining 95 statements that we included in step 3 of the analysis of the concept mapping. For step 3, participants took those 95 statements that were generated and engaged in this unstructured sorting and rating of the 95 statements. Basically, the sorting instructions are each participant does it individually, and we did what's called tabletop sorting. All of our concept mapping work was in person. All this can be done online, but given the kind of work that we do in the community engaged nature, we feel that it's more appropriate to do it in person to support to be there to support our participants and to get a range of participants who might not have necessarily the level of computer literacy and internet access it takes to complete the concept mapping online. So basically, we took the 95 statements and we printed each statement on cardstock. So we handed participants 95 statements, so a deck of cards, and we asked them to read each statement and to sort the statements into groups based on similarity and meaning to them. And there were additional caveats to the sorting process, but they did this individually. And after participants engaged in the sorting process, then we handed them a rating sheet, and we asked them to rate their 95 statements. And as they were rating their statements, a facilitator took each of their participants' sorted piles and wrapped rubber bands around them and put them in an envelope. And once participants rated the 95 statements based on similarity and meaning to them and ease of intervening, we took those statements and also added them to the manila envelope, and then we sealed it. At the conclusion of the structuring process, 42 participants engaged in this. That included, we conducted 6 meetings in groups and 18 one-on-one sessions. But again, I just want to remind you that although participants could meet in groups, the process was done individually. So now I want to share with you some of the select descriptive characteristics from the participants. And so as study enrollment, majority were male. I'm sorry, the majority were male, that is true. But the median age was 53 years. 35% were stably housed, 6% were unstably housed, and 72% were stably housed. I was reading that wrong. 12.5% were unstably housed, and 4.2% were homeless. And so again, this points to this idea that we definitely needed to be inclusive when it came to how we defined the neighborhood of residence. The overall neighborhood disadvantage measure score was 3 standard deviations above the United States neighborhood disadvantage score. As I mentioned earlier, we use concept mapping for all analyses. And concept mapping, we entered the data via their online platform. And again, here's the link. I do want to point out, though, that concept mapping has changed from group concept mapping to group wisdom. It's the same company, same kind of project, but I actually have not used group wisdom yet. I've only used their older platform. Okay. So we use the concept system software to conduct the analyses, and concept systems takes the participant data and creates this cluster analysis. So basically it takes participants' sorted statements and represents the participant group sort and maps the ideas and concepts of how the group sorted statements together on average. The mapped ideas are equal to the relationships between statements. So the closer the concepts are, for example, on the map, the clusters are on the map, the closer those statements were sorted together. And so The closer the statements are as well, the more similar the statements were sorted together as well. Then the system creates cluster boundaries to basically provide this visual indication of similarity. Then the rating data are used to depict the perceived importance of each cluster. And this is represented by the cluster thickness. Again, this shows how important this cluster is in relation to the other statements. And so when we did our cluster analysis, we refined the cluster statement. We ran a cluster scenario of between 20, I think, to 4. And based on the interpretation and the ease of understanding and intuitiveness and theoretical meaning and parsimony, we actually settled on a 12 cluster solution to represent participant generated ideas. And once we had the cluster solution determined, we looked at the statements within each cluster. And based on those statements within the cluster, we assigned a cluster label to represent the overall concept or theme of each cluster. In some projects, participants can be actively involved in determining the cluster solution and assigning labels to each cluster, but we were concerned about participant burden. And so the research team, we engaged in this process ourselves. So now I'll move on to the data interpretation section. So this figure 4A, presents how the statements were grouped into clusters based on participants' sort data. And this is what's known as the cluster point map. So this does not entail any of the cluster ratings. Basically, it just shows you the orientation of the concepts on the map, the cluster label, and the number of statements within each cluster. Now you'll see that we created this kind of grid. That is not a part of the concept system software, but that is the grid that we overlaid onto the map because we saw that there was clear sorting based on the levels of a socioecological model for the most part. So you'll see, for example, at the upper left quadrant, is the neighborhood clustering, the 3 clusters that represent the neighborhood. To the right are family and friends, clockwise origin. Then at the bottom right, there's the clusters for the individual level resilience resources. And last were the healthcare and policy resilience resources. And I just want to point out, we didn't even ask a question about organizational level resilience resources. This emerged organically, and we're very thankful that participants made these kinds of statements because thinking about resilience resources within the healthcare system itself is something that could be pretty important for a population who has to seek services on a continual basis. And so again, I just want to indicate that, for example, if we look at the neighborhood level, there are 3 clusters reflecting neighborhood social services, neighborhood order, and neighborhood social support. And each of the points within the cluster reflect the statements that were sorted into that particular cluster. The stress value at the bottom was of the figure you'll see is 0.19, and that indicates how well the maps represent the individual sort data, and that is a very, very good stress value, comparatively speaking. So it fits the data very well. Figure 4B, I omitted the points, the statements from the map, but now you can see the cluster ratings, basically. So the more layers there are in the cluster, the more it was rated as important relative to the other clusters. So for example, if we look at the individual level clusters, you'll see self-care, compassion, and empathy, patient activation, so HIV-related health behaviors, and then patient activation, medical care were rated as very important relative to the other clusters. Whereas if you look at the neighborhood domain, neighborhood social services, and neighbor social support weren't rated as important relative to the other clusters. And neither was HIV-specific resources, I'll point out. So as I mentioned before, just a few of the clusters, I'll just go ahead and talk about the different levels, but also unpack some of the examples of the statements within those clusters in subsequent slides. But before I do that, I'll just say that there were 3 clusters within the neighborhood level, neighborhood social services, neighborhood order, and neighbor social support. Within the interpersonal level, there were two clusters, so instrumental and informal social support and emotional social support. At the individual level, we had advocacy and no stigma, religion, spirituality, and volunteerism, patient activation, medical care, and then patient activation, health-related behavior specifically. And last, this idea of self-care, compassion, and empathy. And at the organizational level or policy levels, we had HIV-specific support resources and healthcare more globally. And again, I just want to point out or remind you all that our research team developed the cluster labels, but the clustering of statements and their orientation on the map is based on participant sorted data. So just to unpack some of these clusters a bit at the neighborhood level, I'll just give you an example of the highest rated cluster within each of those domain levels of a socioecological model. So at the neighborhood level, the most important state cluster within that level was the neighborhood order cluster, and it contained 9 statements, and the rating was 4.34 on a rating scale of 1 to 5, course, with 5 being the most important relative to the others. 3 example statements, which were the top rated, were being able to live in a safe neighborhood environment, somewhere like not high crime and police accessible, living in a neighborhood where I do not see drugs or alcohol being used outside in my neighborhood, and third, living in a neighborhood with safe housing. At the interpersonal level, again, focusing on family and friends, emotional social support was the highest rated cluster within that interpersonal level domain. There were 8 statements that were sorted into this cluster. The top 3 were my family helps by keeping me in their prayers. My friends and family treat me like anyone else without HIV, and having a strong support system such as family, friends, pastors, or peer mentors are resilience resources that help them overcome ongoing challenges in life so that they can stick with their HIV care. At the individual level, self-care, compassion, and empathy what emerged as the most important cluster within those at the individual level. And there were 20 statements sorted into this cluster. Again, we're representing the top 3. The cluster rating was 4.73. And example statements included my self-confidence, which was rated as a 4.95, again on this 1 to 5 Likert scale rating, strong belief in God, and third, I accept that I'm living with HIV. At the organizational level, healthcare emerged as the most important cluster within that domain. There were 10 statements that were sorted into the healthcare cluster. The cluster rating was 4.47. The top 3 statements included the top 3 rated statements included having programs that pay for HIV medications, like the Ryan White program, HIV clinic employees treat me with kindness and compassion, and getting positive feedback from my doctor when I make positive lifestyle changes are resilience resources that they draw on at the health organizational level to help them with the ongoing challenges of life so that they're able to stick with their HIV care. So that's one interpretation. Well, not one interpretation. That's one component of the analysis that you can get from concept mapping. So again, I'll actually just go back a little bit because I want to show you that this gave us an idea of some of the domains that would be covered in a future measure and how the statements were grouped together. So for example, thinking about them as particularly like subscales. Okay. And then in addition to the rating data representing the relative importance of each cluster, there are also several other things that can be done with the rating data. You can conduct t-tests, but that was not of relevance to our project, so we did not do that. Instead, we use the rating data to create these pattern matches or ladders, and that basically is a Pearson correlation coefficient representing the strength of the correlation in cluster ratings based on demographic variables or other variables that are germane to your research interest. And so for the current project, we were interested in whether the perceived strength of cluster ratings were similar, by like what was the strength of the correlation coefficient by age, gender, housing status, and neighborhood risk environment. So I'll just show you a few examples of the correlation coefficients, and I'll show you just some examples of what those ladders look like. And so if there is a perfect correlation, then the rungs on the ladder will be horizontal for each of these. This shows that there's a little bit of divergence between males and females, but not very much. The strength of the cluster rating was 0.96, which is very strong. And as you can see, they were perceived to be similar in importance between men and women, with the exception being that males rated neighborhood social services as a little bit less important than females did. So at the bottom of the ladder, it shows the lowest rated cluster. So for males, it was 3.41, and at the top is the highest rated cluster. The cluster rating is 4.78. For females, 4.76 is the highest, and then 2.71 is the lowest. When we looked at cluster ratings by age group, we looked at participants' ages 54 and older and less than 54 to kind of capture that median split. And what we found is that the strength of the correlation in cluster ratings was 0.92 between those different age groups. For individuals who were stably housed versus unstably housed, we saw similarly strong correlation coefficients. Interestingly, I do want to point out that people who were unstably housed or homeless rated neighborhood social services as slightly higher. And actually, neighborhood social support is much higher than individuals who were stably housed. But again, the strength of the cluster rating was 0.92. And we saw similar strength in cluster correlation coefficients across all of our demographic variables of interest, and including the neighborhood risk environment. They were all above 0.90. So based on this research, what we conclude is that, from a topical approach, is that researchers should examine resilience resources really specific to African American and Black adults living with HIV specifically, and at multiple levels of a socioecological model. And we thought a significant strength of this research is that the overwhelming majority of resilience resource items were generated by study participants. So they had a wealth of knowledge when it comes to their lived experiences about the resilience resources they're able to draw upon to overcome life's adversities. It is evidenced by the 365 statements generated by just 27 people. So the items that they generated reflected the multi-level nature of resilience, again, within the context of a socio-ecological model. And participants identified organizational level factors as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we had not considered organizational level as a component of our focus prompt. So it was great that participants generated that, again, organically. And what this work also identified is that we should be creating non-generic resilience resource measures that are specifically relevant for people living with HIV, that include statements like Ryan White, or I'm not ashamed of living with HIV, or I accept that I'm living with HIV, and other specific items that can help people overcome adversities in life. And lastly, using concept mapping allowed us to identify that the perceived importance of these resilience resources really cut across demographics and neighborhoods of varying levels of risk. So I just want to take some time to talk about step 6 and how we plan to utilize the concept mapping findings. One of the things that we're working on, and I just say that with a little bit of a laugh because I'm a little bit behind on this, but we're going to take the results from the concept mapping AIM 1 paper and create a lay audience appropriate animated video to describe the study results. So it'll be a nice video that can be disseminated widely and shared with study participants, and also via internet and social media channels. And the script is in development to create that to disseminate the results back to community members. We also plan to, I guess I can't say plan because we've already done this. We took the concept mapping results, the items generated and retained from the concept mapping, and we performed psychometric testing of the items to create a reliable and valid resilience measure. And what we did there, and I can just say generally that the psychometric testing results are very good to excellent, and we're in the process of submitting a manuscript. We followed this checklist for developing a measure, and we adhered to pretty much all of the steps, ranging from cognitive interviewing to structural equation modeling. So exploratory factor analysis, exploratory dimensional analysis, and confirmatory factor analysis, and measurement and variance. And again, the items perform very, very well. So that's very great news for us. And lastly, we will examine whether resilience and non-resilience factors are prospectively associated with HIV outcomes by the level of the neighborhood risk environment. And as a sub-aim, we'll assess for interactions between resilience and non-resilience factors by the level of the risk environment. So for this step, we are still in the process of continuing with data collection. Okay. With that, I mean, this concludes my talk, but of course, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our funding agency, as well as the concept mapping participants, the clinic staff, and our team, our entire team, for their important contributions to this work. It really was a collaborative effort involving all of us to make sure that we were representing the lived experiences of participants in an insightful, informed, and ethical way. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk, and now we'll transition on to the Q&A. So thank you, Rochelle.
Wonderful, Akilah. Thank you so much. What a rich talk. There is so much to explore here. So what I want to do is, first, I'll remind folks that they can send me questions or comments in the chat, and I'm going to move them on to Akilah. But first, I want to one of the things I want to do in our conversation, Akilah, is to go back through some of those steps because I have questions about them. So I don't know if you'll want to refer to your slides, but be at the ready. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. I just wanted to say that. I guess I'm going to start a little bit backwards because you acknowledged your team. So I'd love to hear how big a team it takes to pull this off, because there's so much going on, the qualitative pieces, the analysis, the software. How big's the team that helps you do this?
So our team was actually quite large because we are working with 2 HIV clinic cohorts in the South. And so we had an investigator from each of those clinic sites. I have amazing Brown collaborators, so Dr. Chanel Howe in epidemiology, and Marta Wilson-Barth, who is also equally amazing. Then we have several people with expertise in resilience and stigma. So that I think that adds 2 more people. So I think I'm at 6. We also have a psychometrician, so Dr. Joe Fava, who's at Lifespan, and I should say Valerie Earnshaw at Delaware, and Sanisha Dale at Miami, and Michael Carey, who's also at Lifespan, Center for Behavioral, oh boy.
Preventive medicine, got you there.
Thank you. Thank you, with expertise in resilience and psychometric testing. And then, of course, we have the amazing clinic staff at the 2 clinics. Now, this is a larger than normal team I mean, it doesn't take that many people to do concept mapping, but we all had a hand in developing the focus prompt, refining the focus prompt, and thinking about that, in an iterative process. And it just so happens that we all work very well together. So it never felt like there was a large team to manage. But usually, I've done concept mapping with just an N of 2 people who are leading the project and doing all of this. It's very manageable.
Great. It's wonderful to hear that. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Joe. I can't see whether he's with us, but he's another member of the CTR core, the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design core. So people should know that his expertise is available through the CTR as well. Okay, so that's a sense of the team. Now give me a sense of the timeline, please. How long does it take to do this? So many steps, right? So maybe think about how you would advise someone, or tell us how you yourself did write this into a grant timeline.
Honestly, Rochelle, it's been so long since we did
Right.
this. I can't even recall the timeline, but I don't know if Marta is on and she wants to answer that question, but I don't think it took longer than 6 months. I mean, we
Wow.
spent the summer doing the data collection. So we traveled to University of Alabama at Birmingham and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Marta and I did on several occasions to do the primary data collection. Either we did it together, I think a couple times one of us went by ourselves and did it with the clinic staff in the room to assist. But it seems like a lot of steps, but each step is very structured and ordered. So once you develop the focus prompts, right, then you go and you collect the data with your participants, and it takes about an hour to generate ideas. So across those sessions, it's not that much time. And if the main issue is recruitment, but we didn't have it handled on recruitment. The clinic staff recruited, so that maybe slow that made the process a bit quicker.
Right. So Marta Wilson Barth, who I assume is your Marta, has written to us in
Yes.
the chat saying that data collection at the clinic took about 2 months. And I'm just gonna, I don't know what you call this, a programming note, but if it's possible, I'd be delighted to have Marta join us if that's okay with you, Akilah. So
If it's okay with Marta, I mean, she was equally in the trenches with me collecting these data, and if she's okay with that, I'm happy for her to join.
great. So I'll, if that's possible, you'll certainly be able to join us at 12, Marta. I have a question in the chat asking if I can access the slides from someone who missed the first 15 minutes and finds it very relevant. So yay that it's relevant. And I just want to pause for a second and say, yes, you'll have access to these slides and also to the recordings of all of you'll have access to the slides because they are part of the recordings of each of the 3 presentations. This one, as well as the 2 previous ones, are available on the CTR's YouTube channel and by a platform that the CTRs use with one another called Diamond. And you can look for information about that in the CTR's weekly email. So if you don't already subscribe to that, it's a wonderful collection of local and more broad resources for research. And if you don't know how to access any of those, you can find them on the CTR's website, and anyone is welcome to write to me at rochelle_rosen@brown.edu, and I will help you get them. Okay, so I want to go through the steps, each of the 6 steps, and I have questions about them. So I'm going to let you decide whether you want to change the slides. So I'll just ask my questions and you'll take us through them. And I see that we have information about how to sign up for Advance-CTR's weekly email newsletter in the chat. I highly recommend it. Okay, so talking about the first step, right? So developing the focus prompt. So you gave us 3 prompts, right? If my notes are correct, what helps you adapt to and stick to your HIV care, the people who help you, and the neighborhood resources. I'm winnowing down significantly the prompts you gave us. I want to know how many prompts is appropriate for exploring. And this one you had 3. I think I've seen another article where there are 2. How many prompts are the right number of prompts?
So when you're using concept system software, you are entering one overarching prompt, but it would not be appropriate, I don't think, to ask people to give you, all of their responses to the individual interpersonal neighborhood level in one fell swoop, because you're not going to be able to unpack the rich detail that you're trying to elicit. And for us, we specifically were interested in asking about individual level resources, interpersonal level resources, and neighborhood level resources within the context of a socio-ecological model. So it organically made sense for us to have 3 focus prompts.
So I love hearing that the model is reflecting the questions that you go into, a good principle for whatever qualitative system or research system you're using. So nice to hear that those things, that one drives the other. So moving on now to the generating. I mean,
Sure.
am I wrong to think of this as kind of like a focus group? Is that what that feels like?
I think I remember early on in my career, I was calling them focus groups, and then I realized that's actually not what it is. It
Right.
is a modified nominal group technique, which is different from a focus group and has some strengths and advantages and or weaknesses, comparatively speaking. With the nominal group technique, you ensure that everyone has the opportunity to speak. Whereas sometimes in focus groups, right, you can be limited by those dominant personalities who tend to overtake the conversation. Additionally, with a focus group, you tend to get more unstructured text that comes with your transcript. Whereas with this modified nominal group technique approach, and people were literally responding to a question. So their responses were very short and focused. And there was not as much, those verbal, pauses, ums and ors and things that you read through when you're looking at a focus group transcript. So it's very different.
So I appreciate that. You'll hear in my question that I principally work as in interviews and focus groups. And while I've done some card sorting and some ranking tasks, I've never really used a nominal group technique in the structured way that it's designed to be used. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about it. So I have some other questions about it, and I'm afraid they're going to sound a little naive, Akilah, but I'm going to put them out there. So I understand that this is much more structured than a focus group, and appreciated your clarity that you get a different kind of data from a nominal group technique than you would get from a focus group. Is there a transcript and a recording?
There is no transcript and no recording because the co-facilitator is literally writing down every statement that a participant generates, and the moderator is repeating those statements to make sure that they have gotten them correctly on the transcribed and correctly on the pad.
Right.
And
so please, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. And so in addition to that, I mean, for each focus prompt, we handed out a response sheet to each participant. And so we collected those at the end, and we looked over those in comparison to the notepad to see if there were things that participants just didn't say that should be added to that pad.
So you anticipated my next question. Like, is there any crosstalk? Is there any unspoken? So you do have a note writing component, but I understand that the product of a nominal group technique isn't a transcript like it would be in a focus group, but it's rather the generation of the statements.
Exactly. And I will say, I talked about the strengths of it, but some of the weaknesses, like the weakness of the process, is that your data are not as rich and you can't probe. A participant gives you a statement and you nod and you say, thank you, and you repeat it and you keep going. And there's sometimes you want to say, well, what is this? And, can we talk a little bit more about that? And there's no probing that goes on. So
yeah, so that would take, that would be a facilitation challenge for me. I'd really have to put on a different, because a lot of the work of what I do in interviews and focus groups is about the probing. So that's an important note, that facilitating here requires a different skill set. So you noted for both the modified group technique and I think for the next step, when you generate the statements, that you did both groups and one-on-ones. In other research, I have found that for publication, people say group data and interview data is different and you can't put them together. Do you get this question, and what's your answer?
I did not get that question. We use the same methodology for the group and the one-on-one. And we talk about this modified group technique, nominal group technique, but it really is an individual activity. There's no crosstalk, as you mentioned, between people. And so they might as well be on an island by themselves. Now, the one thing that I have gotten pushback on in manuscripts is that concept mapping is not a mixed method. And people don't often see where the quantitative component comes in. And so I have to explain that a little bit more in the manuscript and argue that, yes, this actually is a mixed method, because these both components of the question couldn't be answered without getting both components.
Right. Oh my gosh, I see it as such a mixed method. That's part of what excites me here. I think you've answered this, but a colleague asks in the chat, in this approach, do you encourage interaction amongst participants? And it sounds like, pardon me, in fact, the opposite is true, right?
Exactly. There's no encouragement of interaction.
Okay. So my next question is, so in step 2, you've generated these 365 statements, and I liked the explanation of the winnowing process where you're eliminating redundancies and sort of cutting them down. I also liked in that step that you are able to add things from that the researchers feel are necessary. Lots of times in projects like this, I say the researchers get a vote too, right? We're absolutely generating and listening primarily to what our community members and participants say, but we are also researchers and know and know the literature. So there are relevant things that we may see to bring in that the participants themselves didn't raise. But the numbers suggest they're actually pretty few. I think 10 of your 116 came from your research team.
That's right.
So I wanted to know about that step. What's the difference between the code lists and the keyword lists? How do you use them in the sorting?
So I thought I take the coding as the overall like theme that emerges, and the keyword is literally a word that comes directly from the statement.
Oh,
So
cool.
if you'll take a look, this was my first time doing this, but I've gotten better, I must say. But if you look at the keyword, it literally comes from the statement. So parents giving children more Southeast Asian food rather than American food. And so I thought of that code. I assigned the code was culture, and keyword is Asian food, and that was based on, again, the research question.
Right, and I can see here there are several family codes that have different keywords because it's like an in vivo,
Mhm.
INVIVO code where you're using the language. So
Right.
my next coding question is there any double coding? Like, do statements ever get two keywords or apply to two codes?
I've never applied. I think it's possible, but I've never used it
Not
in
had
that
to?
that way. Yeah, it's more so this idea of, can I sort the data together so I can clean it in a systematic way? Because once we, do this coding and keywording, that's the only time we use it, is to clean the data. Thereafter, participants are telling us how the data are grouped into themes, and so we no longer use it after it's cleaned.
Wow, I love that you're being led in that way by the concepts that emerge from the information your participants give you. Okay, I have one more question before I'm gonna, I think, move us to a more shared experience, and that's going back to step 2. You talked about content saturation. Could you talk at all about the system you used to assess that? Clearly, you said you knew it and you had it.
We
You document that?
No, we did not document it. It was, I think, an idea of Martin and I looked at each other and was like, did you hear anything new? No. Did you? No. But we're still going to have several more of these because they're on the schedule. And did we hear anything new from the subsequent ones? No.
Right.
And I
Okay.
mean, it was not a systematic way. It was just, oh, we're hearing the same things. And maybe we've gotten one new statement, but it was that law of diminishing returns.
Okay, that gives me room for one more question. Do the prompts ever change between groups, or once you've set them, they are firm?
Once we said it, it was firm.
All right.
I think if we change the prompt, then we would have to discard the prior data.
Right. Because I can understand that. So that's a real difference between this method. I assume that was the answer, but I asked it because I wanted to highlight this is a real difference from the way I teach other qualitative methods where flexibility plays a role. Here it does not. So,
No, so you just better make sure that you really like your focus prompts and vet them multiple times.
right. Okay. So we're at 2 minutes of the hour. And what I want to do is just take a big deep breath myself. I have another dozen questions and I'm going to ask them in the next half hour. But I want to thank everyone for coming to this part. Let people know that anyone who stays past 12 o'clock is